my kind of first question, and this was the big debate that kind of took place when I wrote this piece, and again, as I said in my monologue, I'm of two minds about it. And I realize there's a nuance, there's a lot of ways you can answer this question, but should people stay together for the kids
There are so many layers.
outside of abuse?
I think that there are so many layers to that. Each family dynamic it almost has their own DNA, right? It's all so very subjective. And that question, even though it's important for us to really fully understand what that means, it's difficult to answer without having specific family case scenarios.
Right.
However, if abuse is present and the abuser is not willing to do the work to remedy that, because at times someone who's being abused, if their partner is willing to get help to mitigate the abusive patterns, they will stay with them. And so we will support that person's decision as long as they're fully educated about the relapse that happens with domestic violence and things of that nature. And so the short end of it is that I think people should do everything in their power to stay together if they have kids. And I think they should do a deep dive analysis of their relational framework, what needs to change, what they need to work on, what they need from their partner. And I think if two people can do that with a trained professional, oftentimes folks are successful.
Do you feel like divorce is something that's just very easy? Is it something that we don't take seriously enough?
It is so easy. It is such an easy process. And it's become, some things I think need to have a little bit of a stigma. I think certain things that have a stigma that are unhealthy, it's good that there's a stigma because it educates the general population that, hey, this is something that we need to be mindful of. And I think what's happened with divorce is it's become completely normalized. And most of us know the statistics on divorce, although the statistics are dropping a little bit, which is great. But it's this idea. Say the question one more time. I'm sorry, the last part of your question.
Just just do you think that it's become normalized and
It's
that it
become completely
too
normalized.
easy almost? I'm not against, I'm not for no ban on divorce or anything before everybody starts freaking out on me. I just feel like culturally it's become a thing that's very just like skip off and go get that divorce done, and not really. This is one of the things that occurred to me in writing this piece and having my own child that never occurred to me is just the long term lifelong effects of getting divorced
Absolutely.
on your
It,
kids, even your adult kids.
yes, it is traumatizing. The thing, we in the mental health world, we have what we call big T, like severe trauma, and then we have little t. And divorce is actually a big T in many cases. It's incredibly traumatic for children. It can actually change the entire course of their life. And so before two adults make that decision to pull the plug, they really have to think about the overall well-being of their child for the rest of their life. Because kids of divorce are more likely to have mental health issues in adulthood, more likely to have substance abuse issues. And so I think it has to be, if you're going to get a divorce, it has to be the most thoughtful, mindful decision that you make, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was on a podcast long ago and I was talking about my heroin addiction that I had when I was young. And the host asked me, Bridget, what can we tell people to try and keep their daughters from going down a path like yours? And I said, don't get divorced. Because it was the kind of moment, the fork in the road for me, where I went from very a straight A student who is a pretty good kid to completely off the rails. Now I can take a certain amount of responsibility for choices that I made and then perpetuating a lot of that stuff later in life. But there was a defining moment in my life. And my husband has given me permission to say it's the same thing for him. I don't think we're alone in saying that that's a defining moment for the kids and which way your life suddenly goes. It
Absolutely. I mean, yeah.
It does seem like you mentioned that the rates are going down, and I was looking at the rates today, and it says, we're at 42%. Back when I was a kid, it was hovering around 50% for a
Uh-huh.
long time.
Right.
But a lot of that is just because millennials are waiting to get married until later, and
Right.
they're staying married longer. But then there were some other interesting facts about why that is, and a lot of it is also just young adults are living at home with their parents longer.
Right.
What are
Absolutely.
you seeing in terms of the reasons for this divorce rate going down?
I think there's socioeconomic reasons. I think also what's really interesting is the term called gray divorce. I don't know if you're familiar with gray divorce, but gray divorce references people 50 years and older, and there's a substantial increase in gray divorce, which is really interesting. And so it's like the baby boomers basically are really, there's an uptick on the divorce on their end.
They can't stop getting divorced. Like, what
And
is
they
wrong with
marry
the
more
boomers?
often. And if you marry twice, your chance of divorce goes up 50%. If you marry three times, your chance of divorce goes up 70%.
Mm,
But one thing, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned in your situation, and it may behoove the audience for me to provide a little bit of education on the child's experience, if that's okay, during a
go ahead.
divorce and early. So one thing we have to realize is that our brain actually develops through the relationships that we have with our parents, and not just psychologically, but also neurobiologically. And so when we're very young children, we learn about relationships through the dynamic that we have with each parent, but also their dynamic. And in that process, it actually forms the brain. And that's why kids who are abandoned at very early ages or abused at very early ages will have neurological issues.
Hmm.
So this is deeper in us than just our psychology. This is actually in our DNA, in our bioevolutionary structure. And so we have to really keep that into consideration if we're contemplating divorce, because it could set the entire trajectory of our child's life in a different direction.
This is one of those things too where I wonder, how do you balance those things as an adult? Why I was, people were saying they made their decisions to leave their marriage. There was no more love. They didn't want to model that for their kid, which I understand, but also, is that just cope? What level of this is um I don't know how you balance those things, because I understand it would be very hard to be in a loveless relationship, or a relationship that just fell apart. And I know my grandparents, it was like, no matter what, no matter how toxic and messed up that relationship was, they stayed together. And then just, I feel like that did kind of inform the boomers a little bit, because they all grew up kind of in the shadow of these quite toxic and crazy dynamics, and they were like, we don't have to live like that. I'm going to go be happy.
Absolutely. And I think in a situation where a person is truly contemplating divorce, I think there's certain questions they need to ask themselves. First and foremost, are they doing their own deep psychological work? Are they going to therapy? Are they learning about their own childhood? Are they doing everything in their power to be healthy people psychologically? That's number one. Because if you're not doing that, then at the end of the day, you can't really trust your own decision making as it comes to your interpersonal relationships. So
Mm.
I think that piece has to be there. I think secondly, are we as a couple, are we doing everything in our power to try to make this work? Are we attending couples therapy? Are we learning about attachment? Are we doing everything are we improving our intimacy? So there's variables in the relationship that have to happen as well. Thirdly, what would be the best for our kids? And I think that parents have to do a deep analysis with their family and the context of their family to determine what is best. And so it looks different in different situations. But what I encourage my patients to do is to do the work personally, to do the work with their spouse, and then to really analyze what would be best for their children socioeconomically, domestically, where they're going to go to school. And then
Hmm.
I think that if you are able to say, hey, we're both healthy individuals and we've just fallen out of love, and we're going to be able to give our kids everything that we can, even when we're apart, then maybe divorce is the way to go.
Yeah. I have known some people who came from they were very well adjusted and thriving individuals, and they came from, it seems like, quite self-aware parents who got divorced, but they were really intentional. They were still friends. There wasn't a lot of animosity. They weren't used in custody battles. But there's so much other stuff that comes with getting divorced. If your kid is, it's bad enough if your parents are getting divorced. Now, if you're having to pick a parent in a custody battle or something, it can get very ugly on top of already just losing your family structure. So obviously a lot of it is just the way that it all goes down.
And what you mentioned, there's actually research to support that, strong research to support that. So there is a direct, and it's not rocket science, but there's a direct correlation between the level of dysfunctionality and the separation and post-divorce and children's mental illness. So,
Mm.
so marriages that end amicably, which probably would indicate two healthier psychological people, right? Typically, kids don't experience as much distress. But referencing the example that you did, if you have a high conflict situation, there's, you're in court battles, you're visiting mental health professionals like me. If those things are happening, then your child is going to have problems. It is absolutely inevitable.
It's so weird because the first time I went to therapy actually was when my parents got divorced, and I was about 12,
Mhm.
and it didn't do anything for me because I was kind of numb, first of all. And second of all, they were like, "How are you?" And I was like, "I'm fine." And they kind of pushed me a little bit, but there's only so much you can do with a teen who's obstinately just sitting there refusing to dig deeper. And then I think we did move. So I don't know that they exactly stuck with it, but that was my first experience of therapy. And it kept me, and I've heard this from other people, kids of divorce usually, that was their first experience of therapy was in the wake of their parents' divorce. It wasn't great or that helpful, and they kind of just told the therapist what they thought they wanted to hear, and then that was it.
There's two reasons for that. One is that a general therapist who's not been trained in forensic mental health and the family law arena, they're not going to be able to provide the adequate services to meet the needs of that child. It is a very specific niche. So that could be one reason. The other, though, is that you mentioned that you were kind of disconnected. We see in kids, especially adolescents, then when their parents are going through high conflict and then the divorce process, kids sort of dissociate.
Yeah.
They detach. And that's the brain's way of protecting the child. And so it's a coping mechanism. And so when they sit down with that therapist, they don't want to be there. They're protecting themselves
Yeah.
essentially.